Hello there. What is going on, everybody? Today we are asking 5 unanswerable, impossible questions. And these are questions that I would love to, if I had a time machine or if I had the ability to bend reality, I would, well, there's a lot of other things I'd do first. But one of the things I'd eventually get to is I'd love to be able to ask the original Star Wars Armada development team, the Fantasy Flight Miniatures development team, these 5 questions about Star Wars Armada. These are unanswerable questions, I say, and they're impossible questions because, well, everybody's moved on. There's non-disclosure agreements. There's licensing. There's a lot of reasons why these questions are difficult, if not impossible, to answer. But if I had that magic crystal ball and could ask lots of questions, these are 5 questions that I would ask. Now, if you have questions that I don't cover in this video, I'd love to hear them down in the comments below. Plus, we're going to be doing a new round of the $25 Amazon gift card giveaway. You just have to be a subscriber and leave a comment on this or one of my videos. It's as simple as that. Let's start with question number 1. First question I would love to ask, if I did, it would be about time. This is more of a timeline of the game. How much time did Armada realistically have left? This is a question that kind of covers the number of ships that they had left, as well as the number of like filler projects that they had left, and also really what were their limitations on extending that timeline? Were they restricted to ships that appeared in films in the Clone Wars animated series? Were they restricted to not do things that we have seen in Legends, or things that extend a little bit beyond what's canon? It's always a difficult sort of thing to try to balance Clone Wars with the Empire and the Rebels, because Rebels and Empire had so many more ships, so many more that were made, so many more that was available. Obviously, there was going to be some time spent in trying to get the Clone Wars kind of caught up. From what reports that I've heard have indicated that there were more plans for Star Wars Armada to have more Clone Wars expansions. However, because that did not happen, it makes me wonder, like, were there also some things that, like, Lucasfilm may have said, it's like, you know what, no, we're not going to quite do that. It's really unsure, and so I wonder really what the timeline realistically looked like. How much longer did the game really have? This game, for those of you not familiar with Star Wars Armada, this was one of the greatest games of all time. It was pre-painted ships, pre-built ships, and it followed sort of on the heels of Star Wars X-Wing, and had just launched Clone Wars starter sets and announced some more expansions right before the Fantasy Flight Miniatures division was shut down, and then these games transferred over to Atomic Mass Games, which never made a single Star Wars Armada expansion. So it was clear that these are the questions we would want to be asking Fantasy Flight and not Atomic Mass Games. But it also makes me think a little bit about how much into canon and extended beyond canon they could realistically go. There's certainly a lot of expanded universe or Legends, ships that would have fit well, and squadrons for that matter, that would have fit well into this game. It would have sort of helped balance the Clone Wars versus the Galactic Civil War timeline, and some of that is sort of shined a light on when we look at what is happening with the Star Wars license right now for other games like Star Wars Unlimited, which is just announced for their Legends of the Force set, that there's going to be Darth Revan is going to be in there, and so it's very cool, and I think Darth Malak is also in there. So if they're able to do some Legends stuff now under the Asmodee banner with Star Wars Tabletop Gaming, could they have been able to do that in this game? Could we have gone back into the Old Republic and even seen ships from that as even all new factions on top of that? I don't know if we would have gone that far. I don't know what else they could have done with that. But if they could have pulled some stuff that was from the Clone Wars, but still sort of in the Legends time frame, like Mandator 1s and things like that, I'm curious what they could have done and really how much that would have extended the timeline. So that's question number 1. It's all about time and how much time they had left. Would they have filled it in with more cardboard expansions? Would they have done some more campaigns? Would they have done card packs and alternate versions of ships and all of those other things? Really, what was their kind of long-term plan? And of course, that's an impossible question because a lot of times they can't really reveal all of the long-term plan stuff, even once they've moved on, because NDAs don't usually have an expiration date. There's certain things you're just really not allowed to talk about. And so I don't expect that would be an easy question for a lot of people to answer. Although maybe there are some people that could answer that with some level of accuracy. It would be very interesting. There's definitely a lot of rumors about this question. Moving on to question number 2. It's a price question. This is a question of price, and not Governor Price, but rather the price of expansions. Prices had gone up considerably. Inflation has gone up, and now with tariffs and everything like that, prices are constantly shooting up. But I'm curious, realistically, how much would the price of playing Armada really have needed to increase to sustain its viability and profitability? In other words, to keep it on the shelf, to keep it as a game that is important to continue to develop, how much would the price have really needed to go up? I remember when the Imperial Star Destroyer came out, I believe it was priced at $50, and that always seemed, and I've heard from rumors that it was grossly underpriced, barely made I think a few pennies of profit or something like that. It was not a very profitable product, but it was also kind of one of those ships that was launched with the idea of, hey, this is going to be a ship that gets people into the game, so we can take a little bit of a loss in the Star Destroyer in order to get people into the game. And then once the game was already out, I think that's one of the reasons why the Imperial Star Destroyer expansion didn't see as many reprints, because it wasn't as profitable. But really, what realistically would the price have needed to be for an Imperial Star Destroyer? And then for everything else across the board? Would it have had to have doubled? Would $100 be too much for an Imperial Star Destroyer? I don't think so nowadays, but hindsight is 2020. So I'm curious what they would have really needed it to be. And would it have also been sort of combined with one of the later practices that we've seen, and that's putting multiple ships in a box? This is something they started doing with the Hammerheads, and we were supposed to start seeing more of this, although when the Clone Wars came out and we saw like a single Pelta in a box, that made me think, well, why are they doing that? But one of the things that was talked about is retailer shelves and pricing, and if we're doing just a single ship in a box, it's taking up too much space, and a lot of the single ships were only like in the teens, like $19, and and so on and so forth. But putting 2 in a box, so this way, yes, the price goes up a little bit, but you're getting more ships, and it's less SKUs, less items. When you can put multiple ships in one box, there's less packaging material, there's less waste, and all of these things. It becomes more efficient, and I think that's really what kind of all builds upon this question is, what would they have done differently with pricing to make the game a little bit more profitable? And but at the same time, you say, okay, fine, Star Destroyer $500, boom, now it's profitable. But then how many people would they have pushed away? So it's delicate balance to find that magic number. And now with hindsight being 2020, I'm curious what the price point would have really needed to be. Now, there are also stories about how, I guess, early on in Fantasy Flight Miniatures days, they had a really great contract. That they had a factory that was making this stuff for pennies. And that's why X-Wing was initially so successful, and why Armada was able to, launch so many things like a Star Destroyer for $50. But not all contracts last forever, and I believe that's one of the reasons why AMG stopped making reprints, is that again, you have to renegotiate a contract, but now they want 5 times the price or somewhere around there. Suddenly it becomes a lot less profitable, or not profitable at all, to continue to make stuff. So really, where would the price have needed to be in order for it to keep going? Now, this is one, granted, well, I would love to ask Fantasy Flight, but I think maybe AMG could possibly answer this as well. Of course, I don't think they ever would. So again, it's another impossible question. What would the price really have needed to be? Question number 3, mistakes. This is a big question, but really, what are some mistakes? What are some things what some regrets that they have? And this is something that I'd love to ask like all of the development team who's ever worked on this game, from the initial design to all of the expansion design. I certainly have some things that I would imagine would be on there, and I know there's been some things that were said. I know I've heard some of the Armada developers talking about some of the things they wanted to reduce in points. Victories being on the list, which those finally made it in with the last update, which is nice to see some of that. But I'm curious what things that were kind of designed a certain way that ended up not necessarily needing to be that way. What are some of their regrets, lessons learned, and mistakes that they learned along the way that maybe they would have done differently if they could go back? If we both had this time machine and could go back, what would they have done differently? There's certain ones. One big one that I always am curious about in particular is salvo. It's one of those things where when salvo was first introduced in Wave 8, and maybe there were a lot of mistakes made in Wave 8, maybe not having, maybe having too many hull on the Starhawk to where you made a ship that's kind of virtually unkillable in 6 turns. Who knows? But salvo attack, when it came out there was this special ruling about, hey, you can't salvo an ignition attack. Those were both two new things. We hadn't seen them before. Can you ignition a salvo, or can you salvo an ignition attack? No, you can't. You can't. Because salvo was new and ignition was new, and you could do ignition at beyond long range. Well, I always felt like, and this is a question I'd love to ask, is I always felt like that rule was put in place to remind people that, yeah, salvo is using the printed rear armament, so just because you're being attacked, you may be out of range of using those dice. You still have to be in range of using those dice. But if, the thing is, ignition attacks can happen at long range, medium range, and close range also. And so, there doesn't seem to be any good reason why you can't salvo an ignition attack that happens to happen at close or medium range. And so I'm curious if that was something like, if you could go back, with hindsight being 2020, don't the rules for salvo already sort of prevent you from salvoing an ignition attack that happens at extreme range, like initial, ignition attacks tended to happen? And would they change ignition attacks as well? Would they make other changes to those? It's a very interesting thing, because Wave 8 definitely brought about some changes to the meta that involved like killing ships on turn 1 and things like that. And I wonder if any of that stuff, if they wish they could have had more playtesting time, or or since we've had years of community play, would they look at that and say, we would have probably done some of those things differently? I'm really curious. And what other lessons learned and mistakes that they might have done? Would you have done the combat interdictor differently? Would that have been a ship that was costed lower, or would you have given it something else? Or was there ships that you wanted to make that you didn't get to? Was there upgrades that were designed poorly that you wish you could have redone completely? I'm curious about a lot of those things. World Championship winners being able to design a card, was that a bad idea or a good idea? I'm curious. Again, I'd love to ask them about the mistakes and lessons learned from, especially from the early days of Star Wars Armada. Question number 4, cloaking. How would cloaking have worked? Because now this of course is a loaded question, because it assumes that we would have seen additional waves of Clone Wars, which again is already rumored that, yes, of course they had more stuff under the hood, they had more stuff cooking. Apparently they may have even had more stuff that had already been approved by Lucasfilm. But assuming that they would have eventually gotten to the stealth ship, had they thought about that? What was their ideas? Did they have a plan for cloaking? Did they have early ideas for cloaking? What were some of the things that like didn't make it past the drawing board? What are some of the things that did make it past the drawing board, made it to playtesting, or would have made it to playtesting had they been able to actually develop the stealth ship, or potentially any other cloaking ship? Now, we have cloaking already for squadrons. You have the TIE Phantom, and they move around a little bit. I have talked about how cloaking would have worked in many videos. I have lots of different ideas, and there's been a lot of homebrew ideas. A lot of people tend to say, though, that cloaking probably would be so dangerous for the game because it could represent a really unfun experience for your opponent. If I am able to shoot you and then cloak and then fly away and you can't shoot me back, that becomes not fun. And I can understand that. Now, granted, I'm of the mindset I want the game to always be fun for both players. While I do play in certain competitive events, I like to keep a casual mindset first and foremost in my mind. Again, I think the game is more about enjoying and having fun than necessarily winning at all costs. And so for me, while cloaking could potentially give you a huge competitive advantage, it may also provide a negative play experience for other people, which then drives people away from the game. If the game is fun, more people tend to play it, and that's one of the reasons why people still play Armada today, and probably will for the rest of time. So that being said, I tend to think that if they were going to do cloaking, that it should be something that happens once per game only. Basically, you start the game cloaked and you can decloak at any point because we already have mechanics like that in the game. If you think about Star Wars Armada being a 6-round game, it's meant to be a single short-term conflict, not necessarily something where you're going to be cloaking, decloaking multiple times over and over again. It's a 6-turn round limit means you probably don't have enough time for that. And to capture a snapshot of a larger battle might involve a ship strategically decloaking at the perfect time, then taking its shots. And maybe it doesn't have the energy or the time to recloak. So I think if you just treated it similar to how you do Radis or some kind of hyperspace assault where the fleet is kind of warping in. You say, hey, I'm decloaking here, and that happens once per game, then I think that works. I think that definitely works. And maybe you can shoot the cloak token. Maybe it's difficult to hit. Maybe you need to do X number of damage. And if so, or if you get the critical effect on the cloak token, you just force it to decloak early. That's a possibility. Maybe some things like that can happen. And maybe it decloaks early and has to spend all of its defense tokens or something like that. And so it's at a disadvantage for the rest of the round. I don't know. There's a lot of different ways that it could go. Those are some things that I've thought about. But again, a lot of people have thought about cloaking and how it could work in the game. I've heard a lot of different ideas. But I like the idea of it being just a once per game effect. And I think if it mirrors mechanics that we already have, I think that would be cool. But I'd love to find out what the developers had talked about, or if they had even gotten around to even thinking about cloaking, which I would imagine they would have probably thought about, and maybe they decided, you know what, we're just not going to do that at all. I would hope not, because it seems like it could be a really fun thing to do, or at least do the ship. Even if you're going to say it's not going to cloak in this battle, but at least do the ship, because there's not that many canon ships for the Republic that we've seen on screen, and so you got to kind of take advantage of all the ones that you can see. And this would have been a great place to introduce Anakin Skywalker as a commander, although we eventually got him in Rapid Reinforcements. And my fifth question is about the expandability of Star Wars Armada, going beyond simple Star Wars. This is more about the Armada system and not necessarily just Star Wars Armada. We saw this with X-Wing, where the system, the flight path system of X-Wing was licensed out to WizKids for use in games like Star Trek Attack Wing, and then Dungeons and Dragons Attack Wing. Would they have been able to do something similar with Armada, which, by my opinion, has the best gameplay system, and could have easily been licensed out for multiple other games like Battlestar Galactica, or even their in-house universe of Twilight Imperium. This could have been a fantastic opportunity to take a game system that they owned and be able to apply it to another IP that they owned and not have to get approval for everything they wanted to do. I thought this would have been a great option. It'd be something great that they could even do today. And what are the barriers stopping them from doing that? Another thing that would be really cool about doing a Twilight Imperium-based version of Star Wars Armada is that the ships for Twilight Imperium do not come pre-painted. They just come in colored plastic, and it's a cheaper plastic. It's not the same, and it's fine. Maybe this would have been an opportunity for them to relaunch a game with the Armada rule system and have it be cheaper ships that are easier to get approved and printed and manufactured, that people can paint themselves, but they don't have to because they come pre-colored. Right? It would have just been a great opportunity to relaunch again. And you could have done it in smaller scale ships, similar to the ones that come in there, where maybe the game could play on a 3x3. They could have tweaked the rule set just a little bit to make it work on a 3x3 with a new game system. And Twilight Imperium has so many ships and so much lore, and they could add new mechanics as it better benefits the game. I guess it's had they ever thought about taking that system and applying it to other IPs and other universes? I also always thought it would work great as a pirate ship game. I mean, Star Wars Armada primarily is a top-down, two-dimensional game. It's like a naval combat, with ships bumping into each other. It doesn't really take advantage of 3D space very much at all. So why not have it work as a pirate game? Even medieval, they had the Terranoth and Rune Wars and all of that stuff. They could have had dragons flying around. They could have had pirate ships launching like little drakes, and I don't know, catapults launching goblins onto other boarding teams and all kinds of things like that. You could have. There's a lot of fantasy stuff that they could have done to make it into like a fantasy pirate game. Squadrons could have been replaced by like griffins and dragons and drakes and little winged fairies with bows and arrows and things like that. There's a lot of interesting stuff they could have done to kind of get the gameplay removed from the difficulties of having a licensed game. But another thing that's cool is, depending on how they did it, they could have even made it loosely compatible with Armada. Like if they did Twilight Imperium Armada, if they ended up making everything like in a similar scale, then maybe you could have even had like Twilight Imperium versus Star Wars. Unofficially, of course, again, stuff like that is always really cool. Like there's other game like HeroClix has stuff like that, and I always liked the idea of being able to, at least casually for kitchen table play, and for fun events, to be able to mix universes and say this game versus that game and stuff like that, which would have been pretty cool. But I'm curious if they had any plans of doing stuff with that system, or if they still do, because again, there's no space-based Star Wars games being made right now. It's all ground battle stuff. It's all dudes on a map. Where's my spaceships at? Where is my spaceships at? So those are 5 impossible questions that I would have loved to have be able to go back and ask the original Fantasy Flight development team behind Star Wars Armada. Let me know some of your questions down in the comments section below and on my Discord, and let's keep the discussion going there. That's going to do it for today's video. I want to thank you all so much for watching. Big thanks to my patrons. You guys are amazing and help make this whole channel possible. I will talk to you later. May the Force be with you. Live long and prosper. Be excellent to each other. Party on, dudes, and always wash your socks.